Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Young Guy International from wherever you're listening or watching this from. Welcome back to another episode of the Young Guy International. The Young Guy International is a podcast stemming from the Young Guy Initiative. The mission here is to create a socially connected world by diving deep into captivating stories, ideas, and experiences from different individuals that shape our world. Today, I'm honored to have Dominic Barton, the previous Chancellor of the University of Waterloo, current chairman of Rio Tinto. He also was one of the global managing partners for McKinsey Co for 32 years. And today we're going to discuss his journey. One of the things that I'll tell you before we get into it, he was born in Uganda and lived there for about 7 years. So there's a lot of conversation that we're going to have regarding that, regarding his journey, regarding to the work that he did as the Chancellor of the University of Waterloo and where he intends to go. Also, with his extensive experience, there's a lot that us young people can definitely tap into. So, Dominic, welcome. Thank you again for agreeing to be on the Young Guy International. We're very honored to have you here.
Thank you, Darren. Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
No problem. Thank you. My past episodes that I've been doing for the second season, I sort of start the podcast sort of tapping into the roots of my guest. So I've asked them to tell me or a greeting or a word or two from their heritage, from their background. But I wanted to spin this one, seeing as you grew up in Uganda and you lived in Uganda for about 7 years. And that's where I wanted to start. I wanted to start by asking you, from your time in Uganda, what is your most vivid memory from your entire experience 7 years? I know it's a long time ago, but
Yeah.
the earliest one that you can remember.
So many memories and experiences. I mean, at a very superficial level, I just say is colors, the color of the earth, the green, just the beauty. It's a beautiful country, and that the vividness. It felt like someone's taken the veil off my eyes in terms of color and vibrancy. So that's an image. And whenever I go back, it's what I immediately feel. The second is the people, the kind of the dynamism. A lot of I went to school. I was able to go to school there. And the friends I had, and kind of what people dreamed of wanting to do. Being airplane pilots or being on the radio, or I wanted to be a farmer. Like, we just had different views. I remember that. And then, and then I guess the other part I remember, I won't go into all the details being talked about. I had Idi Amin came to our home at one particular point looking for terrorists, if you will, another form of guerrillas just outside where we were. So the experience of meeting him at a very young age, when he was actually at the time not seen as crazy or anything like that. He was a well-regarded general. But anyhow, so that there's lots of memories, and it's really where it's a big part of my growing up is from that country,
Yes.
Wakano.
And you did mention the fact that you do go back a lot recently. And when I was doing my research, I saw that your parents started a missionary back in the 1960s. Is there still a connection between you and that work that they started, or has it changed and adjusted into something else that it is now?
Yeah, there's still a relationship, but it's not. But it's my dad was there to set up a theological college, Bishop Tucker College, which was in Makano, and my mother was a nurse, right, who was there, and so I've gone back to visit. The theological college is thriving. There's a lot of people. My dad, when we moved back to Canada, a lot of students, some of the faculty would visit in Canada, so there was always that kind of a connection there. So it's my godfather. One of my godfathers was Janani Lawum, who was the archbishop, who was actually killed by Idi Amin. But there's a lot of sort of a feeling of linkage, to a very bad period, which is was Uganda was able to come through and get through well. But it just reminds you of kind of just the development of the country and where it is. So I'm not involved in that college in any direct way, but the students and faculty and people are they're very strong linkages.
Which is true. And linking that now to the work that you previously did, because your tenure has ended as Chancellor of the University of Waterloo, there have been ties, obviously, learning from those experiences. I want to go into that a little bit and talk about, obviously, right now, the University of Waterloo, we have very many passionate students, passionate about multiple things across campus. There's a lot of student expression. And from your experiences seeing this and supporting this from your level at the time as Chancellor, how important is or has student expression been to you throughout the years that you've been at UW?
Yeah, I think it's very important. I mean, universities are special places where people can be able to speak about whatever they want to be able to speak about. Should feel free to be able to do that, and that's always been a tradition. I think I'm proud of how the University of Waterloo's done that. That's, with President Vivek Goel, I think he thinks about that carefully. I think, in these, when they're controversial issues that come up where people have different views, I think it's very important to make sure that there's reasonable conversation that actually happens, and that people don't move into kind of didactic, you know, it's one or zero type of thinking. Things are typically complicated. I think it's important to have voice for that, but to be able to go through it, right, and be able to have as as well as one possibly can rational conversations about that. But I think it is universities are important and have played that type of role throughout, history, if you will, particularly in North America. But I think, again, for me, I would just always would stress that sort of reasonable, rational conversation about 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 where things, making sure people can understand, and all the voices get to be heard, and where it is, and that it doesn't, and being very careful too about, there's always, sometimes there's it's right versus right decisions, right? One, it could be right, but can also affect someone else's rights in terms of where they are. And I think we just need, those are tricky decisions to focus on and work on. So it requires a good process to be able to have those kind of conversations, discussions in a constructive way.
True, true. And you've spoken again very passionately about the changing world. I've seen on in convocation when you address the students and the parents. There's a lot of discussion that you have about how young people are the future, but we are also going to be able to mitigate the different issues that the world, from a global perspective, are facing now. And on that note, obviously you've spoken about having meaningful conversation, but what other advice would you give young people on how they can effectively tackle issues that they're passionate about? So it's beyond just speaking about it, but we are actively and tangibly getting out there and making change at whatever capacity and level that we can.
Well, I think there's two things I would emphasize on that. One is that I think it's important to have a voice and have your say, express your point of view. Don't hide in the background or assume someone else is going to do it. I think that's part of being a leader, is you have a perspective and you have a voice, and you're engaged. I think the second thing, which is extremely important to me, is there's one thing to have a voice, the other is to have impact. Just because you have a voice doesn't mean you have impact. And I think it's very important to think about what is the way I can try and influence a decision. And I think a lot of people stop or fall short of that second one. They just focus on the voice and not the, okay, if we're going to have impact with this, what is it that, we need to do to be able to affect some change, or make sure that people understand that. Because at the end of the day, I think you want to have influence, not just loudness. So thinking through both those elements is important, and understanding how decisions actually get made, and being able to work in that, I think, is an important part of leadership. Otherwise, it's just loudness.
True, true. I agree. I want to take us on a tangent a little bit because you did mention impact. It has. I've been in many panel discussions where the question of how you measure impact is something that has been hard for many people to sort of grasp and sort of answer. But from your perspective and in your career and in your journey, how do you feel impact can be measured beyond influence, for example?
Well, I think there's a number of dimensions in the impact investing space. For example, I think you can, one organization I'm involved with, LeapFrog, we look at the number of people in the target area. In there, we're looking at, people, let's say, earning less than $11 a day. How many of those people's lives have you improved through the service that you're either providing, or product that you're selling? And you can measure that, right, in terms of where it is. In healthcare, it's sort of, there are measures in terms of the improving the quality of life. That doesn't have to just be longevity. It can also be around the quality of life. So I think that there are actually quite, on the climate side, you can, on the decarbonization or biodiversity, there are ways of measuring that. So I think that there are ways of doing it. I think where it gets tougher is well-being, the mental happiness, and stability. But there's a lot of measures, I think, that are there that you can look at. And I think it's important that if you're going to do impact work, that you do have some set of measures that you're focusing on. It's not some nebulous concept.
True. So you would say that if there are organizations or if there are young people that are looking towards creating this impact or tackling solutions effectively, is they should have a measure that sort of explains what that impact is, so that as you're working towards it, you have something that you are aligning your work essentially towards. And tying that back to a conversation that we had recently online when I had asked you to be on the podcast, you said that right now you're very passionate and you're working towards sort of Indigenous peoples in Canada, the truth and reconciliation aspect of it. And still on that point of impact, and beyond speaking and creating dialogue around the issue, how do you believe Canada can better support tangibly the preservation and obviously the revitalization of Indigenous peoples and their cultures in Canada? Maybe tying that to impact,
Sure.
but also tying it to that tangible work.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a number of dimensions, and it goes without saying that this is a long journey because we're coming from a very bad place. We heard Elder Henry talk about that at many of the convocations and sessions, not in a angry way, but a realistic way of, the residential schools, people had were not allowed to speak their language, the huge amount of discrimination that went on, and fundamentally just a complete lack of respect for the culture and the history. And I think we've been making progress, but we're a long way from getting to where we need to be. And so I think there's at least two dimensions to impact. One is, what is the state of the well-being of Aboriginal people, traditional owners, First Nations people? How many people are employed? What's their health level? What's the education level? How many Indigenous students do we have in the university? Right. Those are some measures as it affects the population, and how do we compare it to the non-Indigenous side? And I think we see some big gaps on that in terms of participation, in terms of GDP per capita, in terms of overall health and longevity, right? So we can measure a change there. The second dimension, which you talked about too, is I think around understanding and respect of culture. And here, I think that some of the measures to me would be, what is the basic understanding of a high school student in Canada of Indigenous culture? How far back does it go? What are some of the core concepts of how Indigenous people think about nature, how they think about science, how they think about healthcare, how they think about law? There's Indigenous law, that. So I think we have a very, very poor understanding, and that's why I got excited, because I actually learned a lot through being the chancellor. Again, it was President Goel who was really pushing that we do this. But I learned so much from Elder Henry on that. And I'm seeing that also in Australia. You know, with my work at Rio Tinto, you know, most of the land in which we mine is owned by Indigenous people. It's their land that we're having the
Mhm.
privilege to work on. And I was recently at an archaeological dig. It's 65,000 years of history that goes into this that we aren't tapping into. I mean, the knowledge that is there that we're not learning from is extraordinary. So I think there's a very big, set of things we can be doing on the second dimension of impact, which is our understanding of the culture. It's not just because it's a moral thing or a right thing. It's actually we can learn. I think we could have better science. We could have better social science if we actually took the time to really tap into that knowledge
Mhm.
of where things are, and I think we're only just beginning on that front.
True, I agree. And before we talk about your work in Rio Tinto, I wanted to circle back a little bit on the aspect you said of it being a social, being it, it. There's lots that we can learn, and for example, having the social science aspect of it. But when you look at mindset and you look at what the indigenous people might be feeling, how do we work with them to make it seem or make sure they do not feel like we are doing this simply because it is what's being spoken about right now, or simply because it's a buzz
Yeah,
right now, and because it's easy to be spoken about, or there's a lot of funding going that way, so we need to start including them. How do we take it away from that and make it more of, because they are people, because they own the land, because they are one of us, we should be working with them, we should be thinking about them?
yeah,
Because I think right now in the world, there's a lot of what's quick to do, what makes what looks good
yeah.
to do is
Greenwashing
what's
and
being
sort of,
exactly.
superficial approach. Well, I think one thing is something you mentioned is you have to. I think we have to start from the premise of respect, right? There is something that we can learn, and I truly believe that. But I think we all have to. This is not about we're doing it because it's the right thing or because there were many wrongs and this is a way to right it. It's not that. It's about there are elements of, for example, how on the environment with 65,000 years of history, they actually have seen quite a lot of change and probably understand how
Mhm.
humans can adapt effectively with nature that we might want to learn from. How you think about water usage, resource usage, um, and then I think there's the whole there's culture, there's the literature, the traditions, social dynamics, as I said, the sociology. But I think this is all from the premise of there's something to learn that we can be better by doing this. We're not doing it because it sounds good or feels good. We're going to learn something, and I think there's many dimensions of that. As I said, there is Aboriginal or indigenous law. It's different than our legal system. There's a view about how to live and work with nature. There's how families operate and how you take care of elders, how you take care of young people, how you interact. That I think we can learn from. Those are three of many, many, many different dimensions that are there. So that I think we need to dig much more deeply into that. It's just something we haven't spent the time tapping into
Explore.
globally.
I agree, yeah. And on that point of obviously tapping into it a bit more and making sure that we are investing our minds into actually learning and understanding, then that can be extrapolated into the different other aspects of really appreciating what it is they do and going beyond, like we had mentioned, greenwashing. When you mentioned you work with Rio Tinto, it was actually a good segue into the next question, because on my research that I've done, I've seen that Rio Tinto is a leading global miner. But my question around this, because right now there's also a general global push towards really understanding mining, really understanding the labor laws behind mining in different parts of the world. But how do you see technological advancements shaping the future of sustainable mining practices when you look at the work Rio Tinto is doing, not just in Australia, but in Canada as well. And yeah, I think maybe we could start with sort of understanding how you see that,
Yeah.
and then the other questions I have around sustainability and corporate
Yeah.
profitability can come.
Well, I think I have a couple of convictions, if you will, or views of the world from on the mining side. The first is that we have a massive gap in understanding and just a supply demand gap between the importance of materials, copper, aluminum, steel, or iron
Mhm,
ore, lithium, nickel, for us to be able to make the energy transition happen. If we're going to get to net zero by 2050, we need material to do that, and there is a huge supply demand gap on that side. There's way more demand than there is supply for these materials.
mhm,
And the challenge there is the mining industry. And I'm looking in the mirror when I say it, we've done a terrible job describing what we do, right? We're seen as,
mhm.
people that pillage the ground, burn it, rip up the ground to get,
Change, yes.
and there's good reason for that, because we have, and you mentioned child labor practices, artisanal mining. There's a whole range of different activities, tailings dams, disasters. But the fundamental fact of the matter, though, is we do not have enough material, the critical material we need to make the energy So we're going to have to do it. And so how do we do it sustainably and effectively, is a critical question. And technology is going to play a very fundamental role in that. I mean, early this morning, I was meeting with our chief technologist. I mean, in Rio Tinto, we spend about $400 million a year on R&D. It's sort of looking for new materials, new ways of processing materials that are, so we can do it in a more sustainable way, ways to be able to recycle that, ways to be able to reduce the waste, ways to be able to rehabilitate faster. There's a whole range of things that are happening and are going to require capital. In my view, I think mining companies are going to have to think of themselves much more as technology companies than they think of themselves today, because of this innovation that's required. And it's, again, this huge gap between the demand and the supply of what we've got. So it's an industry that's in the midst of a couple of very important transitions, but with a reputation that is crap. And so that's what we have to work on, to have the social license to be able to do what we need to do. Yeah. So again, I think that the mining industry has to do a much better job of earning the social license to be able to mine and process what's important. But I also think there needs to be a better understanding of the world, of the importance of mining, because we will not be able to make the net zero commitments which the world needs to make in 2050 if we do not have the copper, iron ore, aluminum, nickel. I could go through a range of lithium. uh, we just won't have it, and we have a very large and increasing gap that's there. So I'm very worried about that because of the scale of what needs to be done, and where the industry is. And I think there will also have to be a lot of technological innovation. We're on every dimension of mining. The materials that we use. I think there'll be a lot of innovation in material science. The Where we find the material, how we process it, how we recycle it, how we rehabilitate the land. All of that is going to have to be re, you know, improved, innovated. So I think there's a lot of exciting opportunities in the industry.
True. And regarding that, how then do you think that with these technological advancements, will they contribute to creating both environmental sustainability, which is what we are trying to achieve, obviously, with the goal of net zero by 2050, but at the same time, because Rio Tinto is a business, ensure that you have corporate profitability? I think I'm asking that in a more broad sense as well, is that there are businesses out there that struggle to manage both environmental sustainability, which is becoming this is a social pulse that so many people are talking about, but they also want to maintain corporate profitability. From your experience, how does one balance ensuring that they have both, or do you not balance and focus on one?
I think the two go together. They're an and, they're not an or. If you are long term,
Mhm,
if you're short term, probably the profitability will dominate the sustainability point of view. But I think companies that
mhm,
think short term are not successful. So it's in the two go together. So we as part
mhm,
of what we're doing, I think what we're doing in terms of our purpose is very important for the world, for sustainability, finding these materials that are needed for the energy transition. But we also want to do it we want to mine in a sustainable manner. So we've set targets. We'll reduce our carbon footprint by 50% by 2030, and we will have zero carbon emissions in 2050. That's a pretty radical thing to say, but and we also want to earn very good profits for our shareholders. We're going to do both, and I think they're very consistent.
mhm,
Um, I'm in favor of carbon pricing, even though carbon pricing doesn't exist. I'm assuming it's going to be in place in 10 years in some manner or form. And so we will operate as though there is a cost to carbon in what we do. I don't really care what policies or not or in the short term are going to occur because we're a long term company. We think in 30-year at least time horizons, and so the two go
mhm,
together. If you're short term, they
mhm.
don't. But again, if you're short term, I don't think you last very long as an organization.
True, because obviously you're thinking of creating simple solutions for now and not thinking about how your solutions are going to impact
Right.
generations to come. And speaking of obviously organizations thinking both long term and short term, there are many young people that are watching this. Many are entrepreneurs, and for young people invested in entrepreneurship, in your experience and in the work that you're seeing now, um, what are some of the key factors that young people can consider when starting a venture, and how can they navigate the challenges of building and sustaining a business and ensuring that it grows and develops?
I think there's a number of core elements to that. I think one is being very clear about the problem you're solving. What is and be as precise as you possibly can, not vague. What is the problem you are trying to solve? And then the second thing I think is being is asking a lot of questions and asking for a lot of help. I find, and I'm myself included, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out stuff myself, or it was not polite, or it wasn't right, or it wasn't seen as a good thing to be asking a lot of questions, or especially asking for help. And I would really emphasize talking to people, getting ideas, what even helping refine the problem that you're trying to solve. Um, but I think it's very important to have that clear mission, which is around the problem you're trying to solve, and then get as much help as you possibly can by talking to people, getting different views, knowing that, by the way, some of the views will be contradictory, doesn't matter, but just hear kind of what
Mhm,
draw on other people's wisdom too as you're putting it through. And then the other part, as I said, is don't be fixated. Make sure you are open minded about the approach as you
mhm,
learn. I may have to change the approach I'm taking. This isn't working. Let's try something else. So I think being it's an overused word, but agile. That you can kind of, okay, this I tried this, it didn't work. Let's go this way. That didn't work quite. Let's try this. Just be
mhm,
adjust, work it, but stay focused on the problem you're trying to solve.
mhm. And as a young person is building and staying focused with this problem, obviously navigating the challenges, how did they instill this idea, this mindset of sustaining the business and ensuring that regardless of the different turns that you're going to have to make, the different rejections that you will have to face, how does one maintain that resolve to continue regardless of all the external factors trying to work against the work that or the business that you have started.
Yeah, well, I think it's sort of, people talk about it as grit, or drive, or it's a persistence. I think that's important, but again, I think you want to be reasonable, because there's a fine line between being resilient and persistent and being crazy, right? I mean, if it's not going to work, then
Mhm,
maybe don't. That's okay to learn, but don't. I wouldn't give up early. Try, push, as I said,
mhm,
try different, move it around, move the kind of
mhm,
components around. But I think it's keeping that focus again. What is the problem I'm actually trying to solve? And if it's really important to you, and which it hopefully is, if you're going to be an entrepreneur and try and build things you want to make sure that that is enduring, right? And what that
mhm,
means is how you are solving that problem today may have to adjust itself over time, and you'd be comfortable for that. But the main thing is just to don't get something out that can be tested quickly. You
mhm,
don't spend years or months trying to develop. Get something that's out quickly that you can test, because you'll learn and
mhm,
adjust faster. And I found that's a mistake many people make. There's that phrase, perfection is the enemy of the good. You know what I mean? No, don't make perfect the enemy of the good, because nothing's
mhm,
perfect.
mhm.
And just
Exactly.
keep adjusting, trying. That's at least the model I would follow.
And it's interesting you said that as well, of the aspect of making sure that if something isn't working, let it go. Maybe it's not what you're meant to be doing. Because there is a quote that Einstein said, don't be too fixated on trying something. You should know when to quit and when to give up, because then that will help you try or put your energy into something else. And still on this point of entrepreneurship, pretty recently, we've seen the growth and the development of social entrepreneurship. And I wanted to pick your brain on how you think social entrepreneurship is going to become a form of entrepreneurship that many people begin to go into because of one, the fact that it's able to balance impact and also profitability. How do you see that growing as a form of entrepreneurship going forward?
Yeah, maybe just before I get into it, what would be an example in your mind of a social entrepreneurship activity?
No problem. So, say for example, I'll give my example of the Young Guy Initiative. What we do is we are a social enterprise focused on helping create a space for young people to be where their interests, needs, and aspirations are heard, and we do that in three different ways. We have a nonprofit arm which does nonprofit work for schools and in Uganda, but we also have the podcast that was created to support the work that the foundation does, because we realize that in order for the foundation to run as a nonprofit, it needs an arm of financing to be able to go into it. So creating an enterprise such as the podcast, for example, to generate funding for a social cause, being the nonprofit organization in Uganda, is sort of a way that we are positioning ourselves to being a social enterprise. So that's the thinking of how I assume social enterprises are being created,
Yeah,
creating business for good, but in sense also generating revenue to run the business for good.
yeah. So I actually don't see a huge amount of difference between social entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship. I think the metrics that you use to evaluate how you're doing may differ, right? But I think at the end of the day, you're solving a problem. You're trying to make something better or different, or some. I think it's important to have that. And then, as you said, right, you need resources to be able to make it sustainable. What's the flywheel that's going to allow that to continue over time? What's the basis for it? Because relying on handouts or aid or charity is not sustainable, right? It's got to have a flywheel, but that's part that's a business model, if you will, right? There is a business model that goes with it. So I actually think that a lot of the core elements of social entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship are very much the same. It's the metrics that may be different, right, in terms of the of how you assess it. It's like there may be more of
Mhm.
a focus on the impact side on a social entrepreneurship issue than on profitability, right? You're in what you've just described, which sounds like a really
Mhm.
good social entrepreneurship initiative, is not so much focused on. You're not trying to maximize profits. You're actually trying to maximize impact, but you need profitability to be able to fund that piece of it. But the fundamentals of the success of both, I think, are quite similar.
True. And on that point, I know you have extensive experience, especially with LeapFrog investments on investments. How then does an organization starting up position itself for the right kind of investments, whether that be for a social enterprise or enterprise in general? How does one position themselves for the right kind of long-term investment, whether it's to venture capitalism? How does one, in your experience through the work that you've been involved in, position themselves for that?
Well, I think on a couple of dimensions. One, again, is being very clear about the problem you're trying to solve, and then the measures by which you will assess success or failure. I think in being very clear, and that again can have a profit dimension and have an impact dimension, right? It depends on where you are on that spectrum, but I think you need both. Even in a pure for profit, if you're not having impact, you're probably not going to be sustainable. And if you're just on impact, but you don't have a cash flow, you're probably not going to be sustainable. So I think being very clear about those dimensions is important. And then you have to immediately then go to who your investors, who are you going to fund? And investors will have a pretty clear idea about what they want as to whether they want to invest in you or not. And they will be looking for metrics to assess that. And I think it's very important to stay close to those LPs, the limited partners in your venture, because they're investing in you for they want results. Again, it's impact and profitability, or but they'll have clear dimensions of that, and I would make sure that that's you're therefore measuring that on a regular basis and reporting it and discussing it with the investors who are with you, or potentially could even be, if it's customers that are supporting you, that they understand what it is that you are, um, you know, delivering, and are they happy or not with that. I think you can then go to the dimension of also employees. Just part of sustainability is also, do people want to work for you or your organization over time? And if you don't treat people properly, you will not have a sustainable business. So I think there's various stakeholders that you need to ensure are feeling good, or at least what you said you're going to do on the tin is actually occurring, or you'll lose the sustainability of that business or social enterprise.
True. And as we wrap up the conversation, I think this would be the best place to talk about just briefly about looking back at your 32 years with McKinsey Co. And now, in a rapidly changing world, obviously, you've experienced lots of different mindsets, but also lots of different people that think about things differently in this world and in this industry. As we wrap up for our audience, are there any particular mindset or habits that have helped you navigate uncertainty, and how can myself or my peers sort of use some of those mindsets to navigate uncertainty and create things that have an impact, but also create growth in the world that we are in?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things, at least as I reflect on my own career and what mistakes I made or things I wish I did differently, and some things I'm glad I did, but maybe I didn't know were going to be that important, because we're all trying to figure this out, right? I very much believe that life is not linear. We don't it's we're trying to learn and discover how it works. But for me, as when I think about it, what's been most important as I look back has been what I call jumping into swimming pools where you don't really know if you can swim or not. And that's come in the dimension of moving to a different country, a radically different place where you don't necessarily know the language, you don't know the culture, you don't have any relationships. You, by definition, are going to be learning at an inordinate intensity. And for me, that whenever I've moved, whether it be to first it was in Australia, then it was in South Korea, then it was in China, then it was in New York. It's your. I found my growth rate increased multifold. It's different roles. I spent some time in government toward the end of my sort of business career. That was an incredible learning and inflect because I learned stuff I didn't even know what I didn't know. I wished I'd done it earlier. I think I would have been a better leader. I think doing work in the social sector is also very important. All my experiences I had there, I learned a huge amount. It wasn't even so much about the impact you're trying to have. I learned a lot about things I wasn't aware of. So those to me are some of the rocket fuel, if you will, for development. By the way, it differs for different people, but I think that's sometimes it's been. I was just meeting with someone last night who's a rower, quite at the Olympic level, and sort of spent a lot of the time rowing versus being in school. But they learned a huge amount about life, intensity, goals, teamwork from a sport, and that can happen too. So again, I think it's your question's a great one because I think we've all got to figure out ways that we can learn fast and we can learn continuously. It's lifelong learning. We're not done when we're finished university. It's a continual process. And one of an old mentor of mine, he was actually not telling me, he was telling someone else this, but it's stuck in my brain. It's kind of, if you're not growing, you're dying. And I think it's a pretty
Mhm.
harsh statement to make, but it's this notion of you just got to keep learning, trying things, be open minded, don't be dogmatic. Why
Mhm.
is this happening? What can I learn from it? Doesn't mean be placid, or don't do anything on thing, but just be curious. Be
Yeah.
curious. And put yourself in situations where you have to learn. Sometimes that's, at least for me, was important. But for other people, that may be the worst thing. I don't know, but for me, that was something that was very important for me.
And I think those experiences, those lessons are things that many people watching, listening can take away from, because that aspect of continuous learning is something that's very invaluable, because through that there's lots that you can pick on and lots that you can use to then have an impact or implement things that can then go on to have greater impact. So I agree with you on the aspect of continuous learning. And I do want to thank you again for sharing, one, your experience with us, but also how best your experience has influenced many of the things that you're able to do. Because I think from your experiences to the audience listening, there's a lot of knowledge that you have shared with us, but also there's a lot that we can pick from what you've been able to do throughout your lifetime. So I do want to thank you for agreeing again to be on the Young Guy International podcast. We're grateful to have you here. We're grateful for you for sharing your experiences with us and with our audience. And we know that there's been very valuable information and insights shared that we are going to share widely. Thank you again for agreeing to be on.
Thank you, Darren. Thanks for having me. Bye for now.
Thank you. And to the audience, thank you again for watching. Please do subscribe, follow us, and we have more content coming. Thank you. Take care, and we will see you soon.
Thanks.
Thank, uh, thank you again.